React Forms with Redux and RTK Query will help us complete CRUD operations in our MERN Stack project. Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will integrate React Forms with Redux and RTK Query in our MERN Stack project. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. In the previous lesson, we set up Redux and RTK Query to store and query data for users and notes. Today, we'll set up the remaining CRUD operations endpoints in RTK Query, as well as the React Form components needed to create and edit both user and note data, and all of that data is kept in our Redux store. A quick reminder that this MERN Stack tutorial series is not for absolute beginners. I suggest you start with Lesson 1 in the series and note the prerequisite courses I recommend for success with this MERN Stack course. Before today's lesson, I highly recommend completing my Redux course. Our starter code is the completed code from Lesson 6. There are no new dependencies today, but we've got a lot to cover, and I'll need to keep things moving. Feel free to pause the video as we go, and remember all of the source code will be available under Lesson 7 in the course resources. Here we're starting in the package JSON, and the only thing we need to do here is increment this to Lesson 7 today. No new dependencies to add. From there, let's move on to the user stories. While we've made progress on many of the user stories we list here, and really this is that informal list we talked about in previous lessons, we've only completed a couple that we can really say that are completed. One of those is to add a public-facing page with the basic contact info. We did that in the last tutorial. And then we also had provide a welcome page after login. And I said in the last tutorial, actually, we did this 2 tutorials ago as we created the React app and just provided those basic things and some routing to those. But today, I think we'll complete a few more. Let's look at number 10 here. Notes are assigned to specific employees. We'll be able to create notes and create that assignment today. Number 11, notes have a ticket number, title, note body, created and updated dates. Now, we previously set that up on the back end with our data models, but now we'll complete that for the front end as well. As well as number 12, notes are either open or completed. So when we create a note, we'll assign that. And number 13, users can be employees, managers, or admins. So when we are able to create users with a form, we'll also be able to complete that. So number 10 through 13 should be completed today. Some of these others we are very close to completing, but maybe we can't say it's completed yet because it also deals with roles and protections and things we haven't applied through authentication and authorization yet. Or there are things just like provide easy navigation, which we have done somewhat with our users list and notes list, but we're not finished yet. We need to provide some more navigation throughout the application. So now with these 2 boxes checked and our target set on lines 10 through 13 here, or I should say goals or stories 10 through 13, let's go ahead and save our userstories.md file and let's move back into the application. So we're inside of the source directory, and then inside of that we want to open up the features directory, and let's go to the users directory and the usersApiSlice. We have already added our endpoint for getting the users, but that's the only one we added so far. So let's go ahead and add the create, update, and delete endpoints as well. So let's find where we started this. We have get users. This is all inside of the endpoints definition of the slice that we have created here. This is the usersApiSlice that's injecting endpoints into the main API slice for Redux and RTK Query. So underneath this get users endpoint that we defined, we can put in the other endpoints, and I need some room to do this. And I just put in all 3. They're not nearly as big as the get users, so we'll just go over these. The first one is add a new user. Now notice this is a builder.mutation. Previously we had builder.query, but now this is a builder.mutation, and that's what these other methods will be. So we're passing in some initial user data, and we're going to the user's endpoint. We're using the post method, and then we're just passing in that data in the body. After that, we're saying we're invalidating tags now. So this will force the cache that we're using with RTK Query and Redux to update. And what we're doing is saying the user list will be invalidated, so that will need to be updated. After that, let's look at the update user endpoint here. So another builder.mutation, we're passing in that user data again, so it looks very much like the post as far as this endpoint is concerned. We're using the patch method, and here's the user data inside of the body. We're invalidating tags here, but now it's not the list. Now we can specify the ID of the user that we're passing in, and we get that with the arg parameter that we have right here inside of this anonymous function for invalidates tags. So we specify that right there, and it invalidates that one user ID. So we know that needs updated again. And remember, we specified the IDs as well as the list here inside of the provides tags for our get users query. So we had the list, and then we also mapped over the IDs, so we can invalidate those as well. After that, we have the delete user. Again, very similar. All it needs to be passed in is the ID here. So instead of spreading in full initial user data, we're just spreading in the ID. Actually, we're destructuring, we're not even spreading. And then we have the user's endpoint, the delete method, and all the body needs is that ID. And then once again, we're invalidating the specific ID of the user. And now as we scroll down, remember RTK Query automatically creates hooks for us. So we had our get users endpoint, and it created use get users query. That was a query. Now remember, these others are mutations. So as I put these in here, you'll see now we have use add new user mutation. So it's named after what we created as far as an endpoint, which was add new user, and then they always append use at the beginning for the hook and mutation at the end, just like query was appended at the end of our get users query. So we have use add new user mutation, use update user mutation, and use delete user mutation. And we'll be able to use all of those today as we create our forms. And now that you understand the additional endpoints we added to our users API slice, let's do the same thing very quickly for our notes API slice. So once again, we're inside of the endpoints builder, and then we have the get notes builder query. So we'll come down right underneath it, and we'll paste in the other three, which you could create as well or grab from my source code. But we've got add new note, update note, and then finally delete note. And this has the similar logic that we just went over for the users endpoints as well. So nothing new there. Now let's come down to the export, and we're going to export these three new mutations that we have here as well. Now before we create our forms, let's go ahead and add some placeholder components. I'll go back to the users directory and create a new file, and this first file will just be named edit user.js, and I'll use my ES7 React snippets extension to quickly create a component, and this is just a placeholder component. So I will save the file, and now I'm going to create another new file, and this is going to be called new user form.js. And once again, I'll use RAFCE to create a new user form, just a placeholder component for now. So we have edit user and new user form files as placeholders. Now let's do the same thing in the notes directory, and I'm going to create edit note, if I could spell edit correctly, .js, and RAFCE with ES7 React snippets, and I quickly get that functional component placeholder. And then I want one more, and this is going to be new note.js. Notice I did not name that new note form. It's just new note.js, and there's a reason for this. I'll do RAFCE. We'll come back to that reason soon, but let's save that. And now we have 4 placeholders for our form data. So we have 2 for notes and 2 for users. Now I wanted to do this so we could go ahead and add the routing inside of our app.js file. Now to do that, we first need to import these new components. So at the top, I'm going to import first edit user. And after we get that, I'm going to import new user form. And then after that, well, I'm not quite at the end. There we go. I'm just getting rid of that semicolon that I'm trying not to use as often anymore. Then I'm going to import edit note. And then finally, we need to add import new note. And remember, it is not new note form, it is just new note for now. Okay, with those 4 imports, we can now add our routing below. We've already created our notes route and our users route. And at this point, I think I want to put notes below the users route. So I'm just going to switch those around. It won't make any difference which is above the other here. So we have the distinct routes of both users and notes, just because I'm going to do users first here. So let's go ahead and add a route. And now inside of this route, we need to have a path. This path is going to be equal to the ID parameter. So we're sending the ID parameter, and that will be part of the path. So we'll go to the dash, we'll be at the root of the website or web app, and then we'll have /dash/users, and finally the user ID all inside of the URL. Now besides that, we need to specify the element. So we'll say element equals, and inside of this we will put edit user, and then we'll have our edit user component. And instead of this closing route, I think we can just close it out inside of the same, so we have the slash greater than instead of the closing route symbol there at the end, or the closing route tag. Now once we've done this, let's copy this down, and we'll have one more path inside of our users path, and this will just be to new. So we could have /dash/users/new, and this should be the new user form. And now I'm going to copy both of these and put them underneath our notes list as well, because it will have the same path pattern for notes. So it will either go to the ID parameter in the URL or new. So we just need to change what we have here as far as the components. So we'll have edit note, or we will have new note. Once again, it is not new note form. Before we begin building our forms, there's one more thing we need to do. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the features directory. We need to be just inside of this top source directory and create a new directory named config. Now inside of the config directory, I'm going to create one file named roles.js, and I will paste this in. It's very simple. We are exporting an object named roles, and this would be a lookup object, and notice the key and actually the string value are the same. So roles.employee equals employee. We're going to use this in more than one file, so I wanted to just create this object one time and put it inside of a roles.js that we can export, and then we can use it in the other files we need. Let's go back to the features directory and back inside of the notes directory, and we're ready to go ahead and update this new user form component. I'm going to start at the top with the imports. Again, I'm going to move faster and paste things today and then go over what I am pasting in. And of course, feel free to pause, slow down, or look at the source code that I'm supplying for this lesson. But we're importing useState and useEffect for this new user form. We're also bringing in the useAddNewUser mutation that we created inside of the userslice. I'm bringing in useNavigate from React Router, and I've also got a Font Awesome icon because we're going to use a save icon from that. And then the roles that we just created are going to be used in this form as well. Being a new user form, that means we're going to have some new input for the user, so I've got a couple of regex constants that I am creating as well. Again, this won't be a public-facing form. This will be something Dandy or his manager will use to create for new staff members to create a new user. So we just need to put some guidance here as far as what can be entered for a user or a password, but we're not being as strict as we might be for a public facing new user creation. Okay, once we have those regexes, we're ready to start working with our useAddNewUser mutation inside of the component. So now inside of this new user form component, I'll paste that in, and we'll take a quick look at what it does and what it brings into the component. So this, unlike the query, gives us an add new user function that we can now call when we need it inside of the component. So it is not activated immediately. And then there is an object that, of course, delivers the status after we call this function. So we have isLoading, isSuccess, isError, and error, much like a query, but the query was called immediately when we used that inside of our list components. This is not called until we're ready to call it. Underneath this hook, let's go ahead and paste in the other hook that we get from React Router, which is just pulling the navigate function that we will also call whenever we're ready to call it from useNavigate. And now we've got some individual pieces of state that I'm using useState for. We've got the username, but then we're also going to have a valid username that is only going to be true, of course, when it meets our regex standards. Same for password and valid password. And then we've got the roles and set roles, so we can set those, and we're defaulting to employee right away for that value. But notice it is an array, so there could be more than one role assigned to an employee or a staff member. And we did bring in useEffect, and that's going to help us validate our username and password. So we're just going to check both of those. So we have username and password as dependencies in each one of these. And as they're changed, we're just testing those regexes that we defined. And in one more use of useEffect, we're going to go ahead and check that isSuccess status that we get after we call our mutation. So if it is successful, we're going to empty out all of that individual state that we're keeping here really, and we're going to navigate back to our users list that is at the /users URL. Now, isSuccess does change, and when it does change, that's what will trigger this. You will get a warning or a complaint if you do not include navigate in here, although we know bringing in the navigate function from React Router will not change. So I just put the navigate in here as a dependency to remove that warning. Now let's go ahead and scroll up to have some more room, and I'll put in the handlers that we're going to use. Instead of starting them with handle, I started them with on. And then we have on username changed, which just sets the username, on password change, which sets the password, but the roles are a little different, and that's because it's a select and then we're doing something specific with them. So let's break this down. We have on roles changed that also receives the event, but then the values we get, we need to build an array from those values, because when it comes in with the event.target.selected options, it is an HTML collection, and that won't give us the same thing we need. So we're using array from, and then array from not only takes that value, but it also has a function. And then we can just get the option dot value from that and create an array stored in values. And that's what we need. So then we set the roles to those values. After that, let's go ahead and put in our save. And we define a can save before we actually allow the on save users clicked to really kick in and do what we need it to, because here we check if can save. So let's look at this can save. I'm going to press Control B to hide the file tree just so we can see that full line here. But we've got can save defined, and notice we've created an array. And inside that array, we put the roles.length because that's an array. We've got valid username and valid password. Then we're calling the every method on the array and passing in Boolean. So we're essentially saying if all of these are true, you could say if roles.length and valid username and valid password. But I kind of like this method for doing it, sticking them all in an array and then having .every with Boolean. And then we do have the ampersand, and we're also checking the isLoading status. So we're saying, and if we're not loading, then can save will be true. And then we check that can save value inside of our on save user clicked. And this is where we call our add new user mutation. And once we call that, we're passing in the username, password, and the roles. Now, before we create our JSX for the form, we've got just a few more things to define. So I'll put those in here and we'll quickly look. We are going to have a select, so it needs options. Now, previously we discussed how to get the value out of that, and that's what we had up here inside of our on roles changed. Well, what we're looking at here is object.values, and then we pass in that roles object that we defined inside of our config directory and imported. So now when we pass that in, we're just getting the values, which was employee and manager and admin. And for each one of those, we're creating an option that can be inside of that drop-down menu that we should have. And we're actually going to display all of those, so we should be able to select more than one. And we'll get to that in a second. But first, we have some other things that we're defining here, and these are classes that we may or may not want to apply to some elements in the form. One of those is an error class. So we're just checking to see if we have error and which class will be applied here, either error message or off screen. Another is the valid user class, the same for valid password class and valid roles class. So we're just checking to see if those are valid. And if they are, then we're not really applying anything. But if they aren't, we're giving the form input incomplete class, which will just outline those in red and highlight the fact that something needs to be completed with those inputs. I'm going to replace our return right here and just return content. So now I want to define the content variable. It's going to take up some space, and we're actually going to need to scroll through that. So I'll put it right here and give one extra line before the return. And now let's look at each part of this form that is held inside of the content variable. Notice I have got a fragment here as the parent for valid.jsx. And the first thing we're putting in is a paragraph with the error class, and that error class is defined above. So it's either off screen, or if we have an error, it's going to display that error message at the top of the form. And remember, we gave some detailed error messages from our back end that it can provide to the front end. So these will be displayed at the top of the form if any of those errors do occur. Then we have our form. So here's a class name form. Remember, the class names that you see here are going to relate back to the CSS that I've created. You can use my CSS, or you can create your own as well. So my class names are relating back to my CSS. Here, onSubmit for the form calls the onSaveUserClicked. So that should work for the entire form. And then we have the title, which is new user, and then we have a button, and this is where we're using that font awesome icon with the save icon. And notice this button has a class name, a title, and then we set the disabled. And so if can save is false, we're using the exclamation mark here to flip that value. Disabled will be true. So if we are not meeting the requirements for saving the new user, then this button will be disabled. So we're getting double use out of that can save variable. After that, we have a label, and you should have a label for each input. And what we're doing here is providing the username and some details here. We're saying it must be 3 to 20 letters. And then inside of this, we have a class name, and here's that valid user class value that might be applied if there is an issue with the username, or if it's just blank, it's highlighting that it needs to be filled out. We've got your basic attributes here, including autocomplete set to off because we don't want other previous names popping up. And this is a controlled input. So we have the username state here, and we're calling onUsername changed during the onChange if that happens. Very similar for password. We give some details here, 4 to 12 characters, including these characters right here. And after that, it's a controlled input, and the same for the valid password class. Now we get to the roles. What I want to highlight here with the roles is that multiple is set to true. So you can select more than one value, and the size is set to 3. So it will display 3 values without being a drop-down. All 3 values will be visible. And then it is a controlled input, so we have roles and on roles changed. And then we're bringing in those options that we defined above. And with that, we have completed our new user form. Let's go back to the file tree now and highlight that edit user component. Let's go to the top of the file, and we'll bring in our imports first, and not nearly as many for this particular component. We'll have use params from React Router because we're going to get that user ID parameter out of the URL. And then we're going to bring in use selector from React Redux and select user by ID. So notice we are not bringing in a query. We're actually going to pull the data, the user data, from the state, and we're going to get that by selecting the user ID. So now I'm just going to highlight the return, and I'm going to replace the content of this particular component. And there's not a lot because we're going to use another form that we haven't created yet, and that is the edit user form. So what we've got here, I'll go ahead and save, is pulling that ID from the use params from React Router that will give us the ID value that is inside of the URL. And then we're passing that ID value in where we're using the use selector hook and select user by ID. Remember, that is a memoized query there that we created or a memoized selector that we created inside of our user's API slice. So we pass in that ID and we get the user in return that has that ID. Now what we're checking here for content is, do we have a user? If we do, we're going to pull in the edit user form that we haven't created yet. But if not, we're just going to provide loading. If you had a loading spinner that you wanted to use here instead, that's fine. This is just a small paragraph that says loading. And then we're returning that content. So this is ensuring we have the user data before we need it inside of the edit user form. And the reason that is helpful is because we want to pre-populate that form. We need the existing data to show up in the form, and this will confirm we have it as we render that edit user form. So now let's create the component we need. So we'll come over here and create a new component and call it edit user form.js. As you might expect, this will be very much like the new user form. We're essentially editing that same information. So I'm going to go fast but highlight the changes. We're pulling in basically the same things with a few changes here for the imports. We've got use state and use effect again, but now we're pulling in the use update user mutation and the use delete user mutation instead of the add new user mutation. And then we've got use navigate again. We've got font awesome, but then we're pulling in not only the save icon, but also the trash can icon if we want to delete. Then we're once again pulling in the roles from our config directory. After that, we're going to have this same regex at the top because we're going to need to check those same fields for the same things once again. Underneath this, I'm just going to type RAFCE to go ahead and get a start on this edit user form component, and we're going to destructure the user as we bring that user in, as we were doing that inside of edit user. We see here the edit user form, and we're passing in the user as a prop. I need to Control Z to undo that. I didn't mean to drag that over, but the user gets passed in as a prop for the edit user form. Okay, back in the edit user form, we're using the two hooks now, use update user mutation and use delete user mutation. They might be called at different times, but we need some different identification for each. So as I paste these hooks in, I want to highlight that the first one, update user, just has is loading, is success, is error, and error that we might expect here. And I can put this on a separate line. But after that, the second one, use delete user mutation. Notice I am renaming the is success to is del success, and the same for is error and the error itself, as we might need all of those. Now we've got our separate functions that we can call too, delete user and update user. And now I'm going to scroll up for more room, and underneath those, I'll paste in the navigate that we're pulling from use navigate as we did with the new user form. And then we've got some state, and it's essentially the same state that we had in the new user form with one addition, and that is active and set active. This has a default value of active inside of our data model when we create a new user, but now we want to be able to change that to quickly disable an employee as our stakeholder Dandy has requested. So if he were to let somebody go, he might want to remove their access immediately. They may still be assigned to notes, and he may not want to have to make all those changes before he deactivates a user. So this is the state here that will help us do that inside of the form. And then we will have the same use effect underneath that checks for the valid username and valid password. Oh, I had it before already too. I had grabbed it before, so I'll just remove that once again. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself when I'm copying and pasting. After that, we've got use effect. Now this use effect checks the is success status, but remember we have two mutations now, so we have to consider both of those. And so we're still just using one use effect, and it's checking the is success status or is delete success. Remember, the is success is for the update. Once again, passing in that navigate function to avoid any complaints inside of our console about that. But we're checking here, is success for the update, or is delete success for the delete. And now as I look at each one of these, they're essentially doing the same thing. And sometimes we can get caught up in that when we're writing code. We write one and then we look at the other. So just a quick refactor here, we could say if is success or if is delete success, and then we should be able to remove one of these blocks, because the rest of it, the consequences of those being successful, they're both identical. So we remove that, and now this is a little smaller, but it does the same thing. I'm going to scroll for a little more room, and underneath this we will put in our handlers, and they are very much like what we saw in the new user form as well. So we've got on username changed and on password changed, no difference there. On roles changed, where we're doing the same thing with the roles as before with array.from. But then we do have on active changed, which is new, but it just sets the previous active status to the opposite because it's a checkbox. So it's either active, true, or false, essentially. And then we've got on save user clicked. Here we have to check to see if we have a password, because we do not want to require the password to be updated every time we edit the user. So it's just optional. And that means we must call update user two different ways, one with and one without the password. Then we also have on delete user click that calls that delete user mutation and just passes in the ID. Scrolling up a little bit now, just underneath that delete user, let's go ahead and put in some more where we define can save. This can save variable is once again needing to check to see if we have a password. And if we do, can save is going to be using that valid password inside of the array that calls .every with the Boolean. Notice over here there is the is loading status as well. I'm going to press Control B just so we can see everything on the screen. And then can save has the array without the valid password in it if password is not being created as well. So we're checking either way there. And then we have the same classes that we did before as far as error class, valid user class, valid password class, valid roles class. Then we're creating some error content. And notice there is a difference here. It's whether we have an error.data.message or a delete error. So this is based on the update, or this is based on the delete mutation. And then instead of a ternary, this is a null coalescing operator. So if the error or delete error are essentially undefined or null, then we'll just have this empty string here that would be in the class, and it won't change the presentation. Or I said class, this is actually the error content itself. So the content would be empty if that was null or undefined. And now speaking of content, that's what we need to return next. So I'll just modify this return right here and change it to content. And let's define our JSX with the content variable. And this, of course, takes up more room than the screen has, so I'll scroll back up. This is very similar to our new user form, except in the edit user, we've got a couple of additions. So here's that error content with the error class provided if it exists. Otherwise, that off-screen class hides it off the screen. And then we've got our form. This form not only has our save button as the previous new user form did, it also has our delete button. And this is where we use that trash can icon. And this will cause that delete user mutation to be called, just like the save user here will cause the update mutation to be called. Then inside of the form, we've got the same inputs except for the addition of this active checkbox. So here's the checkbox. It is still controlled with checked either active or of course not, whatever is there. And then we've got the on active changed handler being called. Other than that, we still have the assigned roles. It is still set to multiple true, so we could assign more than one role. We're displaying all three roles at the same time, so it's not a drop down as much as it is a list where more than one can be selected. With those changes in place, I'm going to save the file, And now I want to bring over another instance of Visual Studio Code that has our backend code in it. So I'll bring this over to the screen. This is from lesson 4, the last time we touched the backend code. I'm going to press Control and the backtick and go ahead and start our backend development server here. This is the REST API that's a big part of our MERN Stack application. It's now connected to MongoDB. It's running on port 3500. Remember, this is the code we finished up in lesson 4, and I've opened a separate instance of Visual Studio Code to run that. So now, if I want to, I'm just going to minimize that and look at our existing code here. I'll go ahead and press Control and the backtick, and I'll type npm start for our React app, and we'll see if we can view the forms we just created or if we have any errors. Now I'm going to drag this over to the left, and we've got our application running here on the right. We should be able to go to the dash that we've previously created, and now we should be able to go to the users list. So let's check that out. And we've got employees in here that I previously created that you should have seen in the last tutorial. We've got Dan D, the stakeholder. He's the owner, so he's an admin as well as a manager and an employee. So you can see different roles are applied to the same user. We've got Mark, who's an employee and a manager, and then we've got Joe, who has the role of employee. Now I'm going to drag this over to the left because there's some things we need to highlight as far as using Redux before we get into each individual form and how we maintain that state. So I'm going to press Control-Shift-I to open up DevTools. Notice I really shrank the application because I want to use Redux DevTools. If you don't have those, of course, you want to install those, and I can put a link to those in the course resources as well. But here I'm highlighting the state in Redux DevTools, and I can open up this API, and notice there's a subscriptions right here. And if I open this up, we've got get users that we needed, our get users query, to populate this users list. And inside of get users, we have a subscription set right here, and it gets this long string. Now, let me go ahead and go to Dandy's page. And here we've got the edit user screen that we created. Notice there is no subscription, and now it went back to loading after just 5 seconds. Why is all of that happening? Well, let's take a look at why that is happening. So to do that, I'm going to close this out, drag our application back to the right, and drag Visual Studio Code back to full screen, close the terminal, and let's look at our usersApiSlice once again. And if you remember, I set the keep unused data for to 5 seconds, and I wanted to highlight this in development because after 5 seconds we went back to that loading screen. It only kept that data for 5 seconds, and that's because there was no active subscription to the data. So after all of the subscriptions are gone, that's when this countdown kicks in. Now the default value is 60 seconds. So if there still wasn't a subscription to our users list, after 60 seconds, we would use the state of our editor's form, and it would go back, or our edit user form, and it would go back to loading. We don't want that either. So there's a couple of solutions here. First of all, I'm going to just remove this as we no longer want it inside of here, and the default keep unused data for 60 seconds will be fine, but we'll see how we can keep an active subscription, and that won't be an issue either. So while I'm thinking of it, let's go to the notesApiSlice as well, so we don't have that same issue, because I believe I kept that in there too. So we'll also remove this keep unused data for 5 seconds and just leave it out of the slice altogether. Now, what we need to do is create an active subscription that remains active even though our user, or our edit user form, I believe we're here in edit users where we got the data, it is just using the use selector, so it's not querying that data again, and that's why we don't have a subscription, but we've already queried the data. We don't want to send another query when we already have it, so we're not using RTK Query, although RTK Query would know we already had that data and create that subscription. We're using a use selector. So somewhat of a preference, but also just to demonstrate what is going on here. So we're pulling this out of the cache and out of the Redux state and using select user by ID rather than creating a new subscription. And we want the notes and users throughout the application. So it's really no problem to create a subscription that lasts for the duration of our protected pages. So to do that, let's close out the users directory. Let's close out the notes directory. Let's go to the auth directory and let's create a new component in here. And we're going to call this Prefetch.js. Now, RTK Query and Redux Toolkit does have a use prefetch hook, but that's not what we're going to use. Let me start out with a few imports here inside of this file. We will import the store from our app directory and the store. This is the Redux store. We're going to import the notesApiSlice, the usersApiSlice. We're going to use a useEffect hook, and we're going to import outlet from React Router DOM. And now let's go ahead and use RAFCE to get that functional component started with our ES7 React snippets. And inside of this prefetch component, I'll just paste in the details and we will go over that. I'll highlight the existing return and put in our details here. I'm going to press Control B so this doesn't go off the screen. So let's look at this and we can see how it works as well. Here's our useEffect, and it's an empty dependency array. So we only want this to run when this component mounts. When it mounts, we're going to log subscribing, and I really want to highlight that or leave it in the code for you because of React 18 and we're using strict mode. So it's going to mount, unmount, and remount, and we'll see that with a subscribing, unsubscribing, and then once again subscribing. And that's only in that strict mode when you're in development mode. But we're going to create a manual subscription to notes and another manual subscription to users that will remain active. So that way we have access to that state and it will not expire in 5 seconds or in 60 seconds, which is the default. And then we'll unsubscribe if we ever leave the protected pages. And we're going to do that. Of course, this returns an outlet, so all of the children. We're going to wrap our protected pages in this prefetch component. This will also help us when we refresh the page and we still want to have that state, including pre-filling our forms. So now that we've created this prefetch component, let's go to the file tree and let's go to the app.js. And inside of the app.js, I want to import prefetch. And there we've got it from features auth prefetch. And once it's imported, all we really need to do is wrap it around everything that starts with our dash, which are the protected pages. So here we'll have route, and then we'll have an element. We do not need a path for this. And inside of that, we will put our prefetch component. And once we have that, we can go ahead and close this because we will want a closing route, and we do not want this to close out until after the end of the dash. And once we've done that, we have now prefetched that data for notes and users for this whole area of our application. Now let's once again go back and look at that prefetch, because I was thinking the one thing I didn't explain really is what this is. This is the manual subscription right here. So we use the slice, then we call the endpoints, then we call the actual query that we want, and then the initiate method creates that manual subscription. Notice in the cleanup method, we are unsubscribing. So if we ever go to any of the unprotected pages, it will unsubscribe as well. Okay, with that saved now, let's see, we're still running our application. Let's drag this back over to the left. And now we've got Dandy's information on our edit user form, and it's not going away. Let's see if we can change Dandy's name to a lowercase d at the end, just for an example. We'll click our save icon. Now we're back at the users list, and we have added that addition to Dandy's username. Let's go ahead and change that back. And now we can also see in the roles, we can hold down the control button and just select one or none, but then it's outlined in red saying, hey, we need something here. Notice also when this is outlined in red, the save button went away. So our can save variable is working as expected too. Active or not active. And of course, Dan needs all of these roles, and we're not changing his password right now. So we'll just leave this empty, but that's okay because we do not have to have it. Although we did, it looks like we applied the red around this, even though we're not actually requiring the password when we edit the user. So we may want to change that. Also, while we're here, let's go ahead and go back to the edit, and notice if I refresh the page, we reload all of that data because we're already subscribed, and that hits the prefetch component first before it comes here. So that really helps our consistency if someone hits the refresh or reloads the application in any way. Now, what else do we need to check? Well, let's go back to our tech notes, and we could view the user notes again, but after the users, we also created that new user form. So let's put /new to check that out. And let's create a new user. I'm just going to call this new user test, and our password is test123, and we'll make him an employee or her and a manager. And then let's hit save. And now in our list, we don't need that or any help from Chrome, but now in our list we have test with an employee manager role. And here is that user. Let's go back and let's delete that user. And now that user is gone. Now, what might happen with our list of data here or with our notes data is, say this was open on more than one employee's screen or more than one staff member, and we might get some stale data after it's open for a while. So we also want this to refresh the data sporadically or at some type of interval that we can control. And we can do that with RTK Query and Redux as well. So now let's go ahead and apply that. I'm going to pull this back over to full screen. We'll close the terminal for now. Let's open up the file tree and go to the app directory and our store.js. Inside of our store, we need to import setup listeners. And notice this comes from Redux.js toolkit query. And I'm going to get rid of those semicolons just because I'm trying to be consistent. Now, after we bring in setup listeners, we just need to add it at the end of our file, and we call setup listeners and pass in the store.dispatch. Once we've done that, we've enabled some things that we can use now with our queries in the users list and in the notes list. Let's go back to the users directory we have inside of the features directory and back to our users list. Notice we're just calling use get users query here inside of this component, but we can pass some things in, including options. So I'm going to paste this in. We just put null, or you could put undefined here as well. This would also work if we did that. After that, we have options. And what we're using here for options are a polling interval, refetch on focus, and refetch on mount or arg change. Really, if we remount the component, we're going to refetch the data. That's set to true. If we put the focus on another window and come back to our browser window, then we'll also refetch that data. So we'll be looking at fresh data. And then we're setting the polling interval to 60 seconds. This is 60,000 milliseconds essentially. So every minute it will re-query that data, and if we have the page open to a users list, then we will get new data again. Now we can also do this inside of our notes list. So let's go to the notes directory, and inside of the notes list we'll do something similar, but I would expect the notes list to be more active. I'll once again change this to undefined. It should work either way, but I believe the documentation shows undefined when you do that. Afterwards, we're just going to change that polling interval to every 15 seconds because the notes could be more active, more than one person could be working on them, so we'll show the most recent data in the list at least every 15 seconds. After that, refetch on focus and refetch on mount or arg change will both be true as well. So after setting this polling interval, you should see a new request for notes every 15 seconds inside of your network tab of DevTools. Of course, you could adjust that if you didn't think it was necessary that frequently, or you needed it more frequently. Either way, but those are nice features to add when you have more than one person working with a list of data and they're needing to reference that data for any changes. And now let's go to the welcome component that's inside of our auth directory, and we have links to the lists for tech notes and for the users list. But let's go ahead and highlight those, and I'll just put in 2 more links with it. So we go directly to the add a new tech note or add a new user link as well. Now that said, we haven't created the forms yet for the notes. So let's get started on that as we have a new note and an edit note component. Now, just like our edit user component that had an edit user form component that was pulled in, our new note component will have that. And you would think, okay, but why didn't the new user have that? Well, the new user has all new data, but the new note actually needs some existing data. So we're going to pull in this use selector and select all users. And then there needs to be a new note form component that we will also use. Inside the body of the functional component, I'll just replace this return, and we're going to use that selector with select all users, which is a memo-wise selector that was created inside of the usersApiSlice, and get all of the users. Once we have that, we're going to check what kind of content do we want to render. If we have the users, then we're ready to render the new note form that will be populated with users data to choose from as well. So we can assign that note to a user. If not, we'll just have a loading message. And then we return that content. So let's go ahead and save that file. And let's go into our directory and create that new note form.js component. We could RAFCE for a placeholder and just get that new note form component there so we don't currently have an error. We should go back to the new note and import that, and we did, so that's good. We already have that, so no error there when we try to check it out. Now we're at the edit note. The edit note has a little bit more to import at the beginning, so let's go to the top here and go over the imports. Oh, I got rid of the name there. There we go. Return that. Now go down and paste in those imports. Now we're bringing in use params because we're going to need the ID of the note. We've got use selector, select note by ID, which is that memo-wise selector that's now created in the notesApiSlice since we're dealing with notes. We also need the users though. So we're going to select all users here as well because this form will be very similar to creating a new note. And then we're bringing in the edit note form that will also need to be created. So we're bringing in data once again and then rendering a pre-populated form to edit that information. So let's go ahead and replace the functional component information here. We're going to get the ID from use params, which should look very familiar to you after we did the same for the users. Now we're getting the note data for the specific note that has that ID with the selector. We're also getting all of the users that we need again. Now our content is going to check to make sure we have the note data and the users data. And if we do, it's going to render the edit note form. And after that, of course, we're passing in the note and the users, both as props there. If not, we have the loading message. And after that, we return the content. So now let's go ahead and create an edit note form placeholder as well. So edit note form.js for the component, RAFCE to quickly create a functional component. And we have placeholders for edit note form and new note form. Now this is very similar to what we have already done with the users, where we had the edit user form, and you can use that pattern. What I'm going to do now is give you a viewer challenge, much like I did with the controllers. We've already spent a lot of time going over these patterns, so now apply what you have learned and try to create your own forms here needed for these two placeholders. And of course, I'm going to put my code in the source code for the lesson so you can go back and check as well. But I think this is a nice place to stop and give you that challenge. And we've got everything else in place. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.